to today's Euranet video debate, where we're going to be talking about the geopolitics of coronavirus. Each week during the lockdown, we're talking to politicians, journalists, and citizens about these extraordinary times we're living in. I'm Dave Keating, and today I'm joined by German MEP Helmut Scholz from the European United Left and Portuguese MEP Lydia Pereira from the center-right European People's Party. And today, we're going to be talking about China. We're going to be talking about China's emergence from the most acute phase of their coronavirus crisis and what we've seen here in Europe in terms of Chinese altruism, in terms of selling medical equipment and other things here in Europe as Europe has become the epicenter of the pandemic. Now, because China has been able to relieve itself from the most acute phase of this crisis, they've been able to free up resources, and those resources have, some have been donated, most have been sold to the countries most affected in the European Union. And last month, we saw a very well publicized shipment of medical equipment sold to Italy and Spain. The planes carrying the equipment got a lot of media attention when they landed. There was a big fanfare, and it really left the impression among a lot of people that at a time when other European countries weren't helping Italy and Spain, China had stepped into the vacuum and was the only one helping out. Now that's since ended. The restrictions on exports of medical equipment from Germany and France have ended. They are now exporting way more medical equipment to Italy than China. But the impression in people's minds still remains when I talk to people. They still have this impression that China is helping out and the EU is not. Now, of course, Chinese state media has been covering these donations a lot, and they've also been talking about China's recovery from the crisis. But there's been a lot of questions asked about how much the reports out of China can be believed, how much the numbers are accurate, both in terms of the current situation of coronavirus, but also with the origins of coronavirus. Today, we had these explosive reports from the Washington Post saying that the US State Department was asking questions about laboratories in Wuhan that were testing coronaviruses as much as 2 years ago. So that's the context we find ourselves in now. What we're going to be talking about is whether Europe should view China as a trusted partner in this coronavirus pandemic or be more cautious, particularly when it comes to possible propaganda. So Lydia, let's start with you. I want to get your thoughts about the actual aid that was delivered, particularly masks to Italy and other medical equipment. Would you say that those shipments to Italy were helpful in the coronavirus fight?
Hello, Dave. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I think it is important to stress out that the role that China has been playing in the management of this crisis has been in this vested altruism, and indeed they've been selling equipment. I'm a bit more skeptical on the donations because we usually say that there are no free lunches, and I think it is important for this discussion to say that the EU sent 96 tons of equipment, medical equipment, to China before the pandemic reached Europe. We can view China's shipments as a retribution, and given the scale of the pandemic, that help was indeed needed. But we cannot talk about the donations per se. So there have been constraints on the deliveries and serious issues. There are many Chinese companies that require real-time payments, and at the minimum delay that they deliver the goods is whoever pays first. So I don't see any sort of altruism in this way of making business, because this is what is at stake. And there are also Chinese companies without certified production selling defective products, and we saw that in the equipment provided, in some of the equipment provided to Spain, for example, which also creates a big problem when it comes to trust and when it comes to qualify China as a trusted partner. I think we do have to have a dialogue. This is a global crisis. We need to partner and to discuss the best solutions for a problem, for a virus that knows no borders. But we have to be cautious on the way we might see this propaganda coming from China, because indeed we saw that there was this first wave of nationalism from a European perspective, from each one of the EU countries. I think the EU reacted later, but the lateness of the response to the pandemic was also due to the lateness of the communication from the Chinese authorities to the health authorities, international platforms, and this delay, the 3 weeks, could have equipped Europe much better than at the first stage of the response. So I think it is. I think we should remain cautious. As I said, it's important to dialogue and to learn from each other, but we cannot ignore that there might be some sort of opportunistic approach towards these attitudes coming from China.
Helmut, what about you? I mean, how helpful do you think these deliveries from China have been? And do you agree that they should be looked at with a bit of suspicion?
I would not start from this angle of the debate, because I think we should first ask ourselves why a lot of member states had not been able to deliver medical instruments and support for all the member states who needed it in a very urgent situation. So, and maybe we should also take into consideration that the Chinese have experienced a very deep impact of this coronavirus crisis on their own social, political, economic life as a first one. And so they had, of course, a certain experience with how far the impact of the COVID-19 can shape a situation in the society. So therefore, they had been, when they had been able for that, ready to deliver medical aid to Europe when it was needed there. And so we should look into the more global dimension of this crisis and the impact of COVID-19 on the health system in our European Union member states. And here I would start to discuss. And so I don't think that the aid and the facilities they have provided to Italy and other countries has just stabilized in a certain very grave moment aid. And I would not say that it is just the aim to interfere into the economies. And of course, in a globalized economy, we are speaking about competition and about a business, as was just expressed. But nevertheless, I would say in the situation where we are in, we should really be quite, what to say, shy and blaming somebody for trying to play a card for their own interest at the first stake. And here I would say we should look really, and here I agree with my discussion partner, to say yes, we have now to think what should be done in having a more mid and long-term ability of the member states of the European Union to reorientate also the value chain of medical equipment back to the member states. So it was our austerities policies in the European Union member states who had cut down the beds in the hospitals, who had cut down the ability to produce certain medicines by our own, and looking for the best money to make. All the big pharmaceutical industries went to China and India, and so they are producing there on very cheap labor cost. And this relationship we also should rethink when we are discussing what is now the outcome of the situation.
Well, Lydia, I mean, on Helmut's point, the EU's solidarity, I think most people would agree, wasn't on great display in the initial stages of the crisis. And so when Italy was really struggling in terms of medical equipment, what should be the EU's response when China is offering help, but at the same time, there's suspicion that it can be used as propaganda? How should the EU respond to entreaties like that if there is this concern?
I don't want to sound populist, but I think some sort of European propaganda would also be important, because the news that we saw with the arrival of the Chinese equipment coming in these airplanes and being disembarked, and we don't see the same with the European equipment being provided for European member states. And we don't see that because we don't have borders. We don't have these, we have a single market. And that's something that I think the Commission did very well to assure the green lanes, to make sure that the supplies would still flow across the Union, and to make sure that supermarkets, hospitals were well equipped with the necessary equipment. But I do believe that we need a more positive message spread it all over Europe, because indeed France and Germany have provided much greater help to Italy already than compared to China. And this is not communicated. And I think, I'm not saying this because I have any sort, I have an agenda against China. It's really not the case. It's just saying that we see a lot of nationalism, a lot of populism increasing across Europe for the last 8-10 years. And we haven't learned the lesson. And here we are witnessing again a third party, a third country coming in, offering help, and Europe is delivering much more, but people cannot feel it the same way. The same, like Austria also transported 1.5 million masks and offered 3,000 liters of medical disinfectants to Italy. Romanian doctors are coming to are supporting Italy, and this is not communicated. And that's what I was saying at the beginning. I think we need a little positive propaganda about what the EU is actually doing for the Europeans, because I think we are being misled in this narrative. And let me just say to conclude, my grandparents saw the Americans liberating Europe. Then we had the foundation of the European Union. My parents remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. My generation, in the most affected countries, and because I have many friends over Europe, will remember the image of Chinese medical teams arriving, as it happened in Italy, or any other countries, receiving thousands of masks from the Chinese flag. But we don't see the same image of the masks with the European flag. And this is something that we have to work around, because the solution is not turning ourselves into bilateral agreements, but we should, as a union, be able to leverage on what brings us together already. And of course, not forget that China is an authoritarian regime with a particular agenda overseas. Europe has to take a stance as well in the relations with Africa and with Latin America, because if we don't do this, and Africa particularly is a strategic partner, it's next to us. If we don't do that, we will be ignoring that a new international order may be emerging, which does not necessarily share the same values that Europe shares.
Let's talk about that communication issue, because another subject of debate has been whether or not the communication about the current situation in China can be trusted, and also the going back the last couple of months about the outbreak. Helmut, what is your take on the communication we're getting from China about the situation of the virus there? Can we believe the numbers that we're seeing?
a good question. If we can believe, I mean, we can only trust that the figures the Chinese are just officially providing to the world community are correct ones. And probably it is very complicated to say, looking to South Korea, for example, where you have again a reinfection of those who had already survived COVID-19 disease. So I mean, what we can judge is where we are able to rely on figures. And I can only but hope that that what the Chinese are giving officially as the figures are correct ones, and nobody can check it. And probably we need much more tests everywhere in the world to find out what is the real infection rate of human beings in the various countries. And that is true for the European Union, that is true for China, that is true for Asian countries, and probably also for Africa. Here I very much agree with Lydia that we should look much more to those countries who has a less developed medical system compared even with the European Union. And one of the problems of the communication is that even now in the crisis, we are seeing the highest rate of infections are in the United States. But probably that is not true. We have to say it is in the European Union, because if the European Union is regarding itself as a joint, how to say it, society of values, then we have not to say, or there in Slovenia only a few cases, and few cases in Estonia, and more cases in Italy. No, then the European Union as such is much higher than compared with other countries. So here we have to be honest also to ourselves, and that means we should take the responsibility to find common and joint solutions for this challenge of COVID-19 to us. And that is our economy which is affected. And if we have a common currency, the euro, then of course we need also common economic strategies in a way that we are not saying, oh no, the social issues, the economic issues, the authority is by the member state, while the common currency is pressing us into one direction. And here to give the economies of the EU member states a chance to find a way of enjoying common responses to such a challenge like this pandemic of COVID-19, then I think we can communicate that also in a way that, yes, we are able, France, Germany, Austria, and others, to help Italy in that situation as it has been done, but in the interpretation and the understanding of citizens, that for them it would be normal that Germans and French are helping because we are inside the European Union. This difference in the communication lines comes from the point that China is not belonging to the EU. So it is a third country which is giving a certain support for finding urgent solutions. And this, I think, we should take into consideration, and that gives us also the chance not to make China blaming or China fearing, etc., interfering into the economies. No, we have to do our homework by ourselves. And when the austerity policy, for example, has pressed Greece to sell the port of Piraeus, then because nobody wanted to invest into Greece in the situation where Greece had been then inside, so then the Chinese came. So we should not blame the Chinese for taking this chance in a competition while we are not doing our homework. So I mean, this is a relationship we have to deal also in the Corona crisis now on that point.
On that geopolitical point, let me put the final question, Lydia, to you, and that is on the big geopolitical picture here. We are in a world which is being changed by coronavirus. How do you think the EU's relationship with China will, or maybe the better question is, should change in light of this pandemic?
I think the EU will have to decide. The EU has several challenges ahead. One of them is, for example, when it comes to industry. We saw that we are significantly dependent on the value chains with the sources coming from China, and if there's any disruption on it, the impacts that it has in Europe. So I think there has to be some evaluations have to be considered. There is also the transatlantic relations that have to be further enhanced. We've seen with President Donald Trump that it's been very much American first, and they have forgotten the importance of our relationships. So I think Europe has to decide how it's going to be the response economically. And this entails, for example, where do we stand on the Green Deal, on sustainable investment, on how are we going to shape the economic model, how we are going to reindustrialize Europe. And I think our relationship with China will depend on this assessment, on this post-crisis geopolitical reorder. But one thing is for sure, Europe cannot rely so much on third countries, particularly in strategic sectors. And so politics and have to come first in these sort of strategic decisions that we will have to make for the future. So we have here three dimensions. It's the European assessment, the relations with the US, also the positioning of the US towards the world, and of course China, and how we will readjust our cooperation. And I'm not saying that we have to, cut our relationships with China. It's absolutely not that. It's just an assessment, and following what Helmut just said, like for example with the example of the port of Piraeus, and many other European countries are subject to Chinese investment. So we have to assess whether or not we want to be we want to have more investment, if we want to leverage on capital that we have in Europe. So I think the decisions that we are taking today will have a repercussion in the medium term, but we will have to have this discussion in Europe. And again, I'm insisting in the partnerships that we have with Africa particularly, and also with Latin America, which I believe are also very important in this geopolitical rebalance.
Certainly. And these are issues that the European Parliament is going to be confronting, I think, in the coming months as we look to rebuild after the crisis. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank both of you very much for a very interesting discussion, which I'm sure will continue in the halls of the European Parliament whenever they are opened again. And thank you at home for watching us either via the live stream or the recording. And we look forward to another great debate with you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.